March 5, 1943. Tunisia. The headquarters of the U.S. II Corps sat quiet beneath a pale North African sky. Not calm, quiet in the way places become after catastrophe, when the shouting has ended and only consequences remain. Inside, Major General Lloyd Fredendall waited. Maps covered the walls. Telephone wires ran everywhere. The room looked busy, organized, professional. It gave no hint that, 2 weeks earlier, the command it represented had been shattered in the worst American defeat of the war so far. When Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived, there was no ceremony, no staff briefing, no attempt at reassurance. Eisenhower had not flown in personally to listen to explanations. The meeting lasted only minutes. Fredendall was relieved of command, effective immediately. The order was verbal, cold, final. Eisenhower did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Nothing Fredendall could say would change what had already happened in the mountains west of Kasserine Pass. Fredendall was instructed to return to Algiers, then onward to Washington. Quietly. There would be no farewell, no public announcement, no chance to address his troops. His replacement would arrive the next day. Major General George S. Patton, Jr. As Eisenhower turned to leave, he did not explain his decision. He didn't have to. 2 weeks earlier, American forces had collapsed under German attack. Entire units had broken. Thousands were dead, wounded, or captured. Equipment lay abandoned across the Tunisian desert. And Fredendall had been nowhere near the fighting. In the days after the defeat, Fredendall had blamed everyone but himself. His subordinates were incompetent. Intelligence was faulty. The troops were inexperienced and panicked. The terrain was impossible. The enemy was too strong. Eisenhower's presence was his answer. Fredendall packed his belongings with the numb efficiency of a man who believed his career was finished. He assumed Washington would bring investigations, hearings, perhaps even a court-martial. After all, Corps commanders were not removed lightly, and they were certainly not removed mid-campaign without consequences. But Fredendall misunderstood the system he served. To understand why his removal mattered, and why what followed mattered even more, you have to go back 3 weeks earlier, to the moment everything fell apart. February 14, 1943. German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel attacked through Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia. The objective was not subtle. Break the American line. Capture supplies. Test whether the United States Army could stand against seasoned German veterans. The test was decisive. Fredendall's II Corps was responsible for a front nearly 70 miles wide. 30,000 men were scattered across broken terrain and isolated positions, many of them without mutual support. Orders contradicted each other. Communications were unreliable. Defensive plans existed more on paper than on the ground. The gaps were enormous. When German armor pushed forward, it found little resistance. Positions collapsed within hours. American units were defeated in detail, overwhelmed one by one. Tanks were abandoned intact. Trucks fled clogged roads. Soldiers ran on foot, chased by artillery fire and the sound of German AT-8s ripping through thin armor. By February 22nd, German forces had advanced nearly 50 miles. American casualties exceeded 6,000. And throughout it all, the Corps commander was absent. Fredendall had established his headquarters deep in a canyon far behind the front, by most accounts, 80 to 100 miles from the men doing the fighting. He had engineers working for weeks blasting a command post out of solid rock, complete with tunnels, chambers, and reinforced walls. While his engineers used dynamite, frontline troops dug shallow foxholes with frozen hands and no overhead cover. One man was building a fortress. His soldiers were digging graves. Fredendall rarely visited forward units. He commanded by telephone, issuing orders to officers he barely knew about terrain he had never seen. When commanders asked for permission to maneuver or concentrate forces, he often denied it, insisting on rigid positions that could not be held. When Eisenhower arrived on February 20th to witness the situation firsthand, what he saw disturbed him deeply. Not just the defeat, but the detachment. A Corps commander isolated from his army, buried underground, physically and psychologically removed from the battlefield. Eisenhower understood something critical in that moment. The problem was not just tactical. It was leadership. Removing Fredendall was not an act of punishment. It was damage control. The disaster was already written into the casualty lists. The only remaining question was whether the bleeding could be stopped. So on March 5th, Eisenhower ended Fredendall's combat command. Fredendall boarded a plane believing he was finished. He had no idea that the worst failure of his career was about to be rewarded. February 1943. Central Tunisia. The mountains around Kasserine Pass were supposed to slow the enemy. Narrow roads, steep ridges, terrain that favored defense. On paper, it looked like a natural choke point, exactly the kind of ground inexperienced troops could hold if properly organized. They weren't. The American positions stretched thin across a front nearly 70 miles wide. Units were isolated, separated by miles of broken terrain with little coordination between them. Commanders received overlapping, sometimes contradictory orders. Some were told to hold at all costs. Others were told to prepare to withdraw. Few understood how their positions connected to the larger plan, because there wasn't one. German reconnaissance identified the weaknesses almost immediately. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel did not need elaborate maneuvers. He needed momentum. On February 14th, German forces attacked through Kasserine Pass with armor, artillery, and veteran infantry working in coordination. They struck where American lines were weakest, bypassed strongpoints, and rolled into rear areas before defenders understood what was happening. The response was chaos. American tanks moved forward without infantry support. Infantry units held ground without armor or artillery cover. Communications failed. Radios went silent. Runners were killed or never returned. Officers struggled to locate their own units, let alone coordinate a defense. When German 88mm guns opened fire, American armor burned quickly. Crews bailed out. Vehicles were abandoned intact. Fuel trucks were destroyed where they stood. Roads filled with wreckage and retreating soldiers moving in every direction except forward. Panic spread faster than the enemy. Entire battalions collapsed under pressure. Some units never received clear orders at all. Others were ordered to hold positions that could not be defended, then blamed when those positions were overrun. By the time commanders understood the scale of the breakthrough, it was already too late. German forces advanced nearly 50 miles in less than a week. The cost was staggering. More than 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. Entire formations ceased to exist as fighting units. And still, the Corps commander remained far from the battlefield. Fredendall's headquarters was buried deep in a canyon, carved out of solid rock by engineers who had been working for weeks. While frontline troops lacked proper cover, his command post featured reinforced chambers, tunnels, and blast protection. He commanded by telephone. Orders flowed from underground to units fighting for survival above it. Requests to maneuver or concentrate forces were often denied. Fredendall insisted on rigid defensive positions, even as those positions were flanked, isolated, and destroyed one by one. Subordinate commanders protested. Some warned that scattering forces across such a wide front invited defeat. They were overruled. When those scattered units were crushed exactly as predicted, responsibility flowed downward. Fredendall blamed his division and regimental commanders. He blamed intelligence failures. He blamed green troops who panicked under fire. What he did not blame was a command structure that made panic inevitable. Leadership during a crisis requires presence. Soldiers fight differently when they know their commanders are nearby, watching, sharing risk. At Kasserine, leadership was distant, both physically and emotionally. One officer later recalled that his men felt abandoned long before they broke. As German forces pushed deeper, American attempts to stabilize the line failed repeatedly. Counterattacks were launched piecemeal. Units that had never trained together were thrown into battle together. Coordination was improvised, often on the move, under fire. The terrain that was supposed to protect the Americans now worked against them. Retreat routes were limited. Vehicles clogged narrow roads. Artillery was abandoned when it could not be moved in time. By February 20th, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. That was the day Eisenhower arrived. He toured the area personally, speaking with commanders and observing the aftermath. What he saw was not just a defeated corps, but a leadership vacuum. Orders disconnected from reality. A headquarters disconnected from its army. The contrast was stark. Men who had fought and bled described orders that made no sense. Positions that could not be held. Reinforcements that never arrived. Support that existed only on maps. Eisenhower understood that the battle itself could no longer be salvaged. The Germans would be stopped eventually, by terrain, logistics, or Allied reinforcements. But the damage was done. The question now was accountability. Fredendall remained in his underground headquarters as the battle collapsed around him. There was no dramatic last stand. No forward command presence. No visible attempt to rally shattered units in person. When the Germans finally halted their advance, it was not because of American resilience at Kasserine. It was because Rommel had overextended and faced growing Allied pressure elsewhere. The Americans had not stopped him. They had survived him. Kasserine Pass became a turning point, but not in the way the public would later be told. It exposed hard truths about training, doctrine, and leadership. It revealed how fragile the American army still was in early 1943. Most of all, it revealed what happens when command is exercised from a distance, without accountability and without presence. The defeat demanded consequences, but the battlefield would not be where those consequences were decided. March 6, 1943. Tunisia. George S. Patton arrived less than 24 hours after Fredendall left. There was no transition period, no gradual handover. Eisenhower's order had been blunt. Take command of 2 corps and fix it, fast. Patton understood what that meant. The corps was not just defeated. It was humiliated. Confidence had collapsed along with discipline, and both had to be rebuilt before the Germans returned. Patton began immediately. He did not start at headquarters. He went forward, on foot, by jeep, wherever the roads allowed. He walked through shattered positions, spoke directly to soldiers, and inspected everything. Weapons, vehicles, uniforms, posture. Within hours, commanders were being relieved. Some for incompetence, some for caution, some simply because Patton believed they did not project confidence. There were no committees and no appeals. One officer was removed for failing to wear a helmet in a combat zone. The message was deliberate. If small standards were ignored, large ones would be as well. Discipline returned before optimism did. Patton ordered units to move closer together, to support each other, to patrol aggressively instead of waiting to be attacked. He demanded commanders know the ground they defended. He demanded they be seen by their men. Most importantly, he demanded presence. Unlike his predecessor, Patton lived forward. He visited frontline units constantly, often without warning. Soldiers saw him where they least expected a corps commander to be, on ridge lines, at gun positions, in muddy assembly areas just behind the line. The psychological effect was immediate. Men who had felt abandoned now felt observed, not in a punitive way, but in a way that restored meaning to their effort. Someone was watching. Someone cared whether they stood or ran. The equipment had not changed. The training had not changed. The enemy had not changed. Leadership had. Patton reorganized command arrangements that had scattered forces across impossible distances. Units that had been isolated were brought back into coherent formations. Defensive lines were shortened. Reserves were created where none had existed before. When German probes resumed, they met resistance instead of confusion. American units began patrolling forward aggressively, denying the enemy freedom of movement. Artillery was coordinated. Armor and infantry trained together instead of operating separately. Small engagements were fought deliberately and won. Within weeks, 2 corps no longer looked like a routed force. The same soldiers who had fled at Kasserine now held their ground. Patton took notes constantly. In his private diary, he recorded his impressions of Fredendall's former command structure with barely concealed contempt. The underground headquarters, the distance from the front, the reliance on telephone orders. He called it the worst command arrangement he had seen in his career. But Patton also noticed something else. Fredendall was gone. There had been no announcement, no public explanation. Officers whispered about his fate, but no one seemed to know what had happened to him. Some assumed he was finished. Others expected a court-martial. Patton did not ask. He was too busy repairing the damage. As II Corps regained its footing, Eisenhower watched closely. The turnaround was undeniable. German attacks stalled. American defenses held. Counterattacks became coordinated instead of desperate. The lesson was uncomfortable but clear. The defeat at Kasserine had not been inevitable. It had not been caused by cowardly troops or inferior equipment. It had been caused by leadership that failed to understand both the battlefield and the men fighting on it. Patton made no effort to soften that conclusion. He relieved officers he believed had become too cautious after the disaster. Some had fought bravely under impossible circumstances, but Patton was ruthless about restoring aggression. Trauma was understandable. Hesitation was not acceptable. Careers ended quickly. Patton believed war rewarded those who adapted and punished those who hesitated. He was willing to be feared if it meant results. And the results came. II Corps became a functioning fighting force again. And yet, even as Patton imposed brutal accountability in Tunisia, something strange was happening far from the battlefield. Fredendall had not disappeared into disgrace. He had disappeared into silence. No charges were announced. No investigations made public. No lessons officially assigned to his name. In the dust and noise of combat, officers began to realize that Fredendall's removal had been surgical, not punitive. He had been extracted. Patton sensed it before he knew it. The Army was punishing failure at the tactical level while protecting it at the institutional one. Battalion and regimental commanders were relieved, court-martialed, and reassigned. Careers were destroyed in the effort to cleanse II Corps of incompetence. But the man who had designed the failure was untouched. Patton understood what that meant. Accountability in the American Army did not flow upward. It flowed down. For now, Patton focused on the war in front of him. Tunisia still had to be won, but the contrast he had witnessed would stay with him. Same troops, same weapons, same enemy, different leadership. And soon, the Army would make clear which kind of leadership it truly rewarded. Washington, D.C., March 1943. When Lloyd Fredendall's plane touched down outside the capital, he expected consequences. He had been relieved in the middle of a campaign. His corps had suffered a catastrophic defeat. In any army that took accountability seriously, this would have been the beginning of a public reckoning. Instead, it was the beginning of a performance. A military band was waiting on the tarmac. Reporters stood nearby with cameras and notebooks. A War Department car idled, ready to carry Fredendall away for briefings and photographs. There was no mention of Kasserine Pass. The official statement released to the press was brief and carefully worded. Major General Fredendall had returned from North Africa after valuable combat service. He would soon be assigned duties commensurate with his experience and rank. The implication was clear. Nothing was wrong. Behind that statement stood General George C. Marshall, the architect of the American Army's wartime expansion. By 1943, Marshall had transformed a small, underprepared force into a global military machine. His authority was immense, but it rested on a fragile foundation: public confidence. Kasserine Pass threatened that confidence. The defeat had exposed uncomfortable truths. American troops were green. Doctrine was untested. Leadership selection had failed. Admitting that a corps commander had been catastrophically incompetent meant admitting that the system itself had failed. Marshall faced a choice. He could allow Fredendall to be publicly disgraced, court-martialed, investigated, and condemned. Or he could remove him quietly, protect the institution, and move on. Politics made the decision easier. Fredendall had powerful allies in Congress. Senators and representatives from his home state were already asking questions. Why had their man been brought home? Why was a decorated general being sidelined without explanation? At the same time, an awkward fact sat on Marshall's desk. Months earlier, before Kasserine, Eisenhower had recommended Fredendall for promotion to lieutenant general. The paperwork had been delayed but never withdrawn. Now the recommendation waited for approval, an administrative ghost from a time before disaster. Marshall chose continuity over honesty. The promotion would go forward. On June 1, 1943, Lloyd Fredendall was promoted to lieutenant general with full military honors. The ceremony took place at the War Department. Photographs were taken. Citations were read aloud praising his leadership and combat experience in North Africa. Kasserine Pass was not mentioned. Fredendall now wore 3 stars, the same rank as George Patton, the man who had repaired the damage Fredendall left behind. The announcement reached Tunisia within days. Officers who had survived Kasserine read the news in disbelief. Men who had been relieved, reprimanded, or court-martialed for failures rooted in Fredendall's orders struggled to understand how responsibility had been inverted so completely. For Patton, the promotion was infuriating. He had just finished purging 2 corps of officers he believed had failed under fire. Some had been cautious, some hesitant, some simply broken by the disaster they had been ordered into. Patton showed no mercy, and yet the architect of the failure was rewarded. The message was unmistakable. Failure at the top was survivable. Failure below was not. Fredendall's new assignment placed him far from combat. He was given command of Second Army, a stateside training organization responsible for preparing divisions before overseas deployment. It was a position of authority without risk. Officially, it was a recognition of his experience. Unofficially, it was containment. Marshall and Eisenhower both understood the arrangement. Fredendall would never again command troops in battle. But neither man would say why. Eisenhower maintained public silence. He had recommended Fredendall's relief and sent Patton to fix the disaster. He knew how badly Fredendall had failed. But challenging the promotion would mean open conflict with the War Department and with Congress. Eisenhower chose survival. His calculation was cold but rational. As Supreme Allied Commander, he needed political capital to manage coalition warfare. A public fight over Fredendall would weaken his position and fracture relationships he could not afford to lose. So the cover held. The Army preserved its image. Congress was satisfied. The press moved on. Only those who had fought at Kasserine understood the price. For them, the promotion was not just a bureaucratic decision. It was a verdict, a declaration that institutional stability mattered more than battlefield truth. Fredendall had been removed, but not condemned. Reassigned, but not punished. Promoted, but never tested again. The system had worked exactly as designed. But the consequences of that decision were only beginning to surface. The promotion did not end the story. It completed it. In Tunisia, the consequences were immediate and personal. Officers who had served under Fredendall's command continued to be relieved, reprimanded, and court-martialed. Battalion and regimental commanders paid for failures that had originated far above them. They had followed orders. They had obeyed dispositions they knew were dangerous. When those dispositions collapsed, responsibility flowed downward. They had no protection. One of the most striking contrasts was Major General Orlando Ward, commander of the 1st Armored Division during Kasserine. Ward had warned Fredendall that scattering his division across a 70-mile front invited defeat. He argued for concentration and maneuver. He was overruled. When the German attack came, Ward fought aggressively, moving constantly between units, attempting to stabilize a situation he had predicted would fail. His division was defeated anyway, exactly as the orders ensured it would be. Afterward, Ward was relieved. Patton believed Ward had become too cautious after Kasserine, scarred by a disaster he had been forced to manage rather than create. Ward was reassigned to administrative duties. His wartime command trajectory effectively ended at the same moment Fredendall's was being rewarded. The message was unmistakable. Competence without connections was expendable. Connections without competence was survivable. Fredendall, meanwhile, settled into his new command at Second Army in the United States. He trained divisions, reviewed manuals, and lectured officers on modern tactics. He never again heard artillery fire in anger. He never again had to send men into combat. Officially, his record spoke for itself. Unofficially, everyone knew why he was there. Letters began reaching the War Department from officers still in North Africa. Some were angry, some were bitter, some were resigned. They asked how the general responsible for the worst American defeat of the war could be promoted while subordinates were destroyed. The responses were uniform. General Fredendall's experience was being put to the best possible use. Personnel decisions were made in the interest of the service. What those letters could not say openly was what everyone understood. Congressional protection had saved him. Fredendall's family connections ran deep into Wyoming's political establishment. Senior senators took an interest in his fate. Questions were raised. Meetings were requested. The implication was clear. Publicly disgrace Fredendall in Congress would demand answers, not just about him, but about the Army's readiness, training, and leadership selection. Marshall understood the danger. A court-martial would not stop with Fredendall. It would expose an unprepared army, rushed into combat before doctrine and training were ready. It would implicate the entire mobilization system. So the institution was protected. The cost of that protection was paid elsewhere. George Patton never forgot the lesson. He punished failure ruthlessly, but he understood that accountability had limits. There were rules for generals, and there were rules for everyone else. Dwight Eisenhower learned the same lesson. When future commanders failed, he relieved them quietly, reassigned them discreetly, and avoided public scandal. Open accountability was replaced by silent management. The system survived. Fredendall remained at Second Army until the end of the war. By most accounts, he performed adequately. Training required administration, not battlefield judgment. No further disasters followed him. He retired in 1946 as a lieutenant general with full honors. Official histories mentioned Kasserine Pass briefly, often attributing the defeat to inexperience and Rommel's skill. Fredendall's name appeared in footnotes, not chapters. He lived quietly afterward. He never wrote memoirs. He never publicly explained his actions or his promotion. He died in 1963, his reputation intact. Others were less charitable. Omar Bradley later wrote that Fredendall commanded from a bunker far behind the lines while his troops lived in foxholes, and that his relief was entirely justified. Patton was harsher in private, calling him unfit for command and condemning the promotion as a disgrace to the service. Marshall defended the decision to his biographer years later. He argued that destroying Fredendall publicly would have damaged morale and exposed systemic failures the country was not ready to confront. He never denied the failure. He defended the compromise, and that compromise set a precedent. It taught a generation of officers that survival depended as much on politics as performance. That blame could be managed. That responsibility could be redirected. That careers could be saved if the right people were kept satisfied. At Kasserine Pass, over 6,000 Americans paid the price for leadership failure. Their families received telegrams, folded flags, and carefully worded letters. Fredendall received a third star. History often speaks of war in terms of courage and sacrifice. It speaks less about protection and convenience. But behind every clean narrative is a set of decisions designed to preserve institutions rather than confront truth. At Kasserine, the Army learned how badly it could fail. In Washington, it learned how well it could hide it. Competence can be negotiated. Responsibility can be transferred. But the cost is never erased. It is only buried.